And I guess, as I say, it's interesting for me. I'll just say this is that, many of the people who fought hard against oil and gas development have now discovered it's our primary asset in the trade negotiations with the U.S. I can't avoid mentioning that irony there. But let's talk about that. I mean, obviously, we've got some people saying we should just cut off oil exports. And you got people like me saying, I need a lot more explanation before I'm going to lose that kind of money that we're taking in revenue, companies, government tax revenue, the whole works. So I'm hoping you can sort of put us straight on that one.
Well, if you look at energy policy, pipeline policy, climate policy in Canada in the last 15 years, there's no evidence that they have ever understood the economic value of oil and gas. I mean, when when people come and say they want to buy LNG and there's no economic case, or that this is our largest source of exports, or this is the largest contributor to the taxes. So the economic ignorance, I guess, of the value of this specific resource to this country is long been misunderstood. So this is actually, in a perverse way, Mike, this is just more of the same. They say, well, we'll fix their ass. We didn't want it anyway. But they don't have much in the as they defend themselves or fight back. They don't have that many tools in the toolbox. So throwing oil and gas under the bus yet again is in many ways just a continuation of policies that have been in that place for quite some time in various ways on multiple fronts.
Oil and gas, of course, or oil especially, has been top of mind when we're talking about the Trump tariffs. Will we use it as a weapon? What is our response going to be? So I thought I'd call on Dave Yager. He's an energy policy analyst. He's author of the book From Miracle to Menace. I've always enjoyed his work. Dave, look, a busy time for you. I'm sure you're getting a lot of questions, but I appreciate you finding time for us.
That's great. Thanks.
And I guess, as I say, it's interesting for me. I'll just say this is that, many of the people who fought hard against oil and gas development have now discovered it's our primary asset in the trade negotiations with the U.S. I can't avoid mentioning that irony there. But let's talk about that. I mean, obviously, we've got some people saying we should just cut off oil exports. And you got people like me saying, I need a lot more explanation before I'm going to lose that kind of money that we're taking in revenue, companies, government tax revenue, the whole works. So I'm hoping you can sort of put us straight on that one.
Well, if you look at energy policy, pipeline policy, climate policy in Canada in the last 15 years, there's no evidence that they have ever understood the economic value of oil and gas. I mean, when when people come and say they want to buy LNG and there's no economic case, or that this is our largest source of exports, or this is the largest contributor to the taxes. So the economic ignorance, I guess, of the value of this specific resource to this country is long been misunderstood. So this is actually, in a perverse way, Mike, this is just more of the same. They say, well, we'll fix their ass. We didn't want it anyway. But they don't have much in the as they defend themselves or fight back. They don't have that many tools in the toolbox. So throwing oil and gas under the bus yet again is in many ways just a continuation of policies that have been in that place for quite some time in various ways on multiple fronts.
What I've welcomed, though, is that the focus on how important it is, not just obviously for the U.S. economy, as we ship, the estimates are 4.3 million barrels a day, but it's for the Canadian, that we really don't have a lot of other weapons. It's so dominant compared to any other suggestion in terms of how we can hurt them, in terms of, and of course, then the other side is how much it would cost us.
If you go back, it took a long time to take fossil fuels and that's the title of my book, Miracle to Menace.
Yeah.
I mean, I had to write a book about it. I was so confused by the policy. So it took a long time to figure that the world could live without this. But the events of the peak woke was of 2020. That's the way I look at it. And that's when Shell and BP told the world they were going to exit the oil business. When Larry Fink at BlackRock was talking about this, and there's an incredible outbreak of amnesia among those who in 2020 said we could build back better, resilient recovery and all that stuff out of oil and gas. So the economic reality has really been hitting home, as have all matters of economics, as people understand they have to pay for this stuff. So the perverse good news of this is all of a sudden, for those that do understand that oil and gas is valuable, they do understand that we have a single market because they blocked access to all the other markets. And so those who do understand the value of oil and gas, all of a sudden we're seeing more interest in pipelines that we spent the last 10 years blocking in the last 10 days than the last 10 years. And I'm talking about, there was the First Nations leader, Indigenous leader in BC that thought Northern Gateway was not so bad. And then he got his hand slapped, but we know what he's thinking. They said, holy cow, we can make some money on this. And then Energy East was back in the news just the other day. Why wouldn't we do that? So it's actually, in many ways, sometimes it takes a crisis to get everybody's attention or something like that. But the good news is, and the other thing that's happened is there's been a lot of education pushback by the industry, a lot of advertising, social media work, that you can't live without oil, that pretty well everything you own is a derivative of oil.
Yeah.
So there's been an educational process that was previously not thought to be required. And that's starting to bear some fruit. People are starting to understand these things. Same thing as a carbon tax. Carbon tax was a great idea until people had to start paying it. And now that it's, at the levels it is, and it's a material contributor to your loss of disposable income. So the great rethink, the post-woke, the rethinking of the entire economy. And then, of course, Trump has really, on the Canadian side with oil and gas, has really exacerbated things. But let's just understand, Trump just told Davos yesterday that we don't need Canadian oil and gas. So he's not, I think sometimes he has to read the news, see the news at the end of the day to see what he said. That's not entirely, that's not true. They still import a lot of oil, 7 million barrels a day of oil in the United States. Most of that comes from Canada. So he's not, a little footloose with the facts on that. He does need Canadian oil and gas and will for the foreseeable future.
Well, let me ask, of course, Alberta heavy crude goes down into the U.S. refineries in the Gulf, but I don't see them having any alternative because they've also announced at the same time, we're not taking any Venezuelan oil. So I just, as I say, I think we've got the cards in terms of why don't we let them pay more? Just let them pay more.
The concept of a tariff is to protect local industries, meaning that your local industry is suffering from unfair competition from outside your borders, right? The trouble is tariffs on imported oil into PADD 2, this West Central, Midwest U.S. that runs entirely on American crude. There are no alternatives. I mean, even if you were to accept heavy oil from Mexico and Venezuela and Saudi Arabia, the plumbing from the Gulf of Mexico to where it needs to be doesn't exist either. So the use of the word tariff on this particular product is disingenuous. They can't replace it. Now, the auto business is different. You can say if we make offshore autos more expensive, they'll buy more locally made ones. But when you're a net oil importer, to put tariffs on oil coming in, thinking that that's going to spur development of oil and gas when you don't have the oil and gas to develop is misapplied. And so I think those of us that study the industry and study tariffs, the idea that they're actually going to put tariffs on oil and gas is unlikely. So the problem actually for Alberta and the oil industry is not in DC. The problem is in central Canada. And it's the muscle flexing, if you will, that, we'll show you, if you do this, we'll do this. And that the Canadian way, or the current Canadian government, if we have economic difficulties, well, let's exacerbate them to the greatest degree possible. Let's make it worse. And so I just find it hilarious that as the national interest for oil and gas has been, in my lifetime, has been defined multiple times. And now the national interest is to use it as a bargaining chip to protect the auto industry. When in the old days, where they built pipelines to Eastern Canada so that we could provide fuel for the auto industry. And so here we go again. So it's a tragedy. We got into this mess, but it looks like there's the initial reaction. It's really regrettable that we have this particular government. We're particularly vulnerable at this time. We've got the government, the prime minister is resigning because of unpopularity, the finance minister's leadership race. Of all the time for the for the Liberal Party to confess that it's not that popular and got its own issues. This is a really bad timing, and everybody's scrambling, and there's no true leadership coming from the PMO, regrettably. And the Central Canadian view is, well, if we're hurting, what can the West do? So nothing's changed there. They do this before. But at the end of the day, I think common sense is going to prevail. I think we're going to continue to sell them oil and gas. I'd be surprised. I'm not so sure that Trump is necessarily going to do everything he said he's done. Certainly, he misquoted himself yesterday. Maybe he's done that more than we think, hopefully.
Yeah, well, I'd say, the other side is, for those reasons, I don't think the U.S. will put tariffs on Canadian oil and gas, but I'm not as confident of that understanding. There's some signs. They say, I'm going to back off till I hear the details. That's a good sign. But I just think Canadians have to be very clear how damaging not their tariff, but anything we did to restrict our exports would be, when it's so important. Biggest export to the U.S., all the lists that we know, how many jobs, depending on your numbers, it's 228,000 to 500,000, depending, how many direct, indirect jobs. We can't afford to do that.
There's a few other tools in the toolbox. You could do the same thing if we were going to put an export tax on Canadian oil and gas to make it more expensive. We could do the same thing with Quebec electricity.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing could do is we could put an import tariff on American natural gas. One of the little things that's not very well understood is, back in the mid 80s, although Ontario natural gas consumption has not increased, it's up about 50% in the last 40 years. The imports of natural gas have gone from almost zero. This used to be completely a Western Canadian market. In 2023, it was almost 1 trillion cubic feet. 980 million or 900 million BCF, 980,000 BCF came in from the States. So why wouldn't we put an import tariff on American natural gas? That would be the equivalent policy. Nobody's mentioned that yet. So we do have an opportunity. We are importing almost 1 trillion cubic feet a year of natural gas from the United States because it's cheaper. Same reason they buy oil from us. So we could fix their butts there as well. But that would, of course, increase the price of natural gas to Ontario consumers. That would be the same impact that the Trump administration is likely to do. We don't see those other options on the table of using energy as this fight back bargaining chip. If you're going to do it with energy, do it with all energy and do it across the board. And as funnily enough, that's not the current plan.
Well, great stuff as usual, Dave, and I appreciate you. I know you were in a meeting. You've come out to join us here, and that is much appreciated. Get your clarity on this. And
well, I hope so. At the end of the day, these things always work out better than they look. That's the problem with this. We've had a couple of weeks, and the media churns. And what are you going to do? What are you going to do? And I think Trump's learning already in his first week in office. He can't do exactly everything he says. Yeah. And I think we're going to see more of that. Thanks for your interest, Mike. Have a great day.
Well, great stuff. Thanks, Dave.
Bye-bye.